It is a great honor to welcome Mark Blitz onto this program. He is a professor of political philosophy at Claremont McKenna College. Thank you, Mark, for joining this show. How are you doing today?
My pleasure. I'm doing fine.
Awesome. I should first like to begin by mentioning that Harvey Mansfield, a great political philosopher and your teacher, was a part of this program a few months ago. He is the reason why I became interested in political philosophy as a discipline. And he was also your teacher. You were among his first students. So
I was among his in his first group of undergraduate students. That's right. There were a few of us, four of us basically, and there were a couple of graduate students there also. But I was in his first group. That's right.
yes. I wonder if you can share some perspectives onto what it's like to have Professor Mansfield as your teacher.
Sure. Well, it was extremely interesting. I think when I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, political philosophy obviously wasn't my main interest. It would be odd, I think, when you're coming as a freshman, especially from an American high school then, for that to be an interest. But I was interested in government and politics as well as interested in natural science. And I took a course freshman year, not from Professor Mansfield, in political philosophy as well as government generally, comparative government, American government, and so on. And I became interested in it. Harvard has a program then, still now, but it's differently constructed now, in which sophomore year, your second year, you took a reading course called Sophomore Tutorial with a small group. And he was my sophomore tutor, and we read all sorts of political philosophy, Montesquieu's Persian Letters, Rousseau's Social Contract, Plato's Symposium, among others. And it was just extremely eye-opening and impressive to learn how to go through a text, that kind of text with such care and learn so much about it. I mean, it was not something generally done. In fact, it was hardly done at all by people who taught, to go through something piece by piece by piece. So what was impressive was the great intelligence with which he did that, and all that you learn by reading those great books so carefully.
Yes. One of the key, or at least well-known feature in being a student of Harvey Mansfield is that he gives you two grades. One to, I guess, to be appropriate enough for Harvard's increasing grade inflation program, and the other is your actual grade. So I wonder if you were part of that as well.
No, back then the actual grades were real. They were hard. We didn't yet have grade inflation. So it was one grade only, and it was the grade that you deserved. And, used the whole range of grades from, at least from A to D. It wasn't as compressed as it is now. That grading system came into being whatever, 20 or 25 years ago, and grade inflation really took off. But back when I was an undergraduate, we had honest grades, I would say.
Let's hear that. So I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Professor Mansfield, and that is, imagine yourself being the lecturer of a political philosophy 101 class, the first of that course. And the students who, they have heard of the subject, but they have not been formally trained at it, and they are interested in joining the course, hopefully through the end. So what would you say to them that would inspire them to follow the discipline beyond at least the course?
Sure. Well, the key thing about political philosophy is that, at least the way we teach it, is that it asks the most fundamental question: how should I live? What's human happiness? What's human excellence? And then it asks the connected question, of course: how should we live? What is the best political community? What is justice? So that's the first and central thing, that it addresses in the deepest way the most fundamental, but also the deepest human question. And then in addition, it addresses in a fundamental way all of the connected basic questions. What is virtue? What are the various forms of political regime? What are the various forms of human excellence, poetically, philosophically? So that's the first and main thing. And then second, of course, would be that one is looking at these subjects not simply on one's own, but with the aid of the greatest thinkers of the past, so that one is looking at the greatest thinkers on the most important issues. That's the fundamental reason to study political philosophy.
I think what really got me interested in the studying of political philosophy, thanks a lot to Harvey Mansfield, is that we we treat these texts, which are written a very long time ago by people who are long dead, as if they are our contemporaries, as if they are speaking to our current political circumstances. You don't read Plato or Aristotle. We have some regard for the historical context in which these texts were written, but that matters little compared to the ideas that were written in it. Would you say that?
Yes, I think what's important is when you read thinkers who are important and who've stood the test of time, you have to read them as if they know what they're doing, that they're in charge of their intention, that everything they write is there for a reason and there for a meaning. And when you look at them that way, you see that the questions that they address are permanent questions. They're unchanging questions for human beings. They're unchanging questions for political orders. And you can learn so much fundamentally by studying them. You don't want to reduce them to an historical period or a class structure or anything exterior to their own intelligent understanding of the topics. And when you look at them that way, you, of course, expand your own understanding from the whatever narrowness you begin with to something much broader and more fundamental. So that is the way to read serious people, as if they have something to tell you and teach you, no matter when they actually wrote what they wrote.
So I would like to segue from Professor Mansfield onto our thinker that we would like to focus on this conversation. I believe in his Student's Guide to Political Philosophy, Mansfield wrote, "The best philosopher of the postmodern is Martin Heidegger, 1889-1976. And if you read his powerful works, you will see the difference between power and greatness." Would you find this statement agreeable? And if so, what would you like to add to it?
Well, his work is certainly powerful intellectually, and in its own way, fundamental intellectually. But of course, his basic and central political association, and for a while it was a close one, was with the Nazis. Mm-hmm. So he lacks, obviously, human greatness or human understanding. That's, I think, the way in which one would best and most usefully interpret that remark.
Yes. I wonder if we can treat, we could read Heidegger the same way as we listen to Wagner, as in, to see which parts of his text are related or closely associated with his own political beliefs, his own Nazi associations, the same way as, say, Wagner and his anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I think with Heidegger, one has to do two things. First, as with any other fundamental thinker and powerful thinker, you need to read him on his own terms. You need to try to see what he is thinking about, what he wants to say about the matters that concern him, to try to follow his often complex arguments to the end and really grasp them. That's how you first must read Heidegger, otherwise you won't do him justice as a thinker. You can then, knowing that you have this connection with an association with the Nazis, begin to try to figure out what that association is in relation to his thought. For a while, and for a long while, a lot of the people who studied Heidegger didn't want to associate his thought with his politics. They wanted to treat his politics as something exterior, something that came from his being provincial, from not understanding what he was doing. I mean, obviously, for a serious thinker and for any serious person, there's going, in fact, to be a connection between their thought and their political activity. So in reality, of course, one wants to look at that and see what it is, but only after you have really given the thought its due and tried to understand it in its own terms, as I said, the way you would with any other serious and important thinker.
I know that Hannah Arendt, a student as well as a lover of his, defended him, saying that we should separate his philosophical thoughts from his political associations. But nowadays, people read it differently, and I wonder, are there parts of his philosophical thoughts that lead him to associate himself with Nazism?
Yeah, I think there's several things. One is, throughout Heidegger's work, there's always an illiberalism, an attempt in the way in which he thinks things to put things together as connected to a particular people, rather than really to think of things in the kind of cosmopolitan way that stretches across particular peoples. So his notion of a people is very much connected, I think, to his notion of Germany during the period of Hitler. And a lot of that is connected also to a certain view he had of the separation of German Jews from Germany, and not just Jews, but others as well. So I would say that it's basically the attempt to see things in terms of a particular people, rather than in the kind of terms which enable you to see that anything in music or art or thought goes beyond a particular people. A lot of that is, I think, at the root, at least, of some of his politics. Also, Heidegger had deep questions about technology and the meaning of technology and the direction of technology. And for a while, at least, perhaps a short while, but for a while, thought that the Nazis might have had this kind of distance from technology, or were so radical that they overturned or sought to overturn the modern thought that was at the basis of liberal democratic politics. From Heidegger's point of view, there was no important difference between the United States and our liberal democracy and the Soviet Union and its communism. So all of those things together, I think, made it quite likely that at that time, Heidegger would have associated with the Nazis. And in fact, he became rector of his university in Germany roughly for a year, and continued to be a member of the party even after he left that position. So it's not just a kind of glancing association, it's a real association. I think those are the parts of his thought that are most connected to that association.
I think we see that Heideggerian desire to come up or conceive of a new politics that is more fulfilling or more inclusive than the kind of systems that we have or already have today, say liberal democracy or socialism or communism. And at that time, I guess to put it in the most sympathetic light possible, Heidegger perhaps have saw Nazism as the new politics that can provide people with meaning that does not make them alienated creatures that Marx mentioned within capitalism, liberal democracy, and whatever system that was existed at that time.
Yes, I think there's something in that. His goal ultimately, intellectually, isn't political. It's this novel understanding of the question of being, the fundamental philosophical question, and then connected to that, a novel understanding of human beings, in that all of our activities are connected to, and all of our structures, our passions, our understanding are connected to a kind of openness to being. The way in which our being, how we are to be, how I am to be, is always an issue or always a problem or question for us. And that is connected always to a kind of public realm. But what happens is that inevitably we fall into the usual and ordinary ways of thinking and acting. We treat ourselves as one of the many, one of the they, as he says. But if we truly see ourselves in the light of our own being and openness to being, we can become, as he says, authentic. And that at the same time becomes something which brings about an authentic people, so that an inauthentic public becomes a kind of authentic people. And there's a sense in which I think that's what Heidegger hoped that he was seeing, or allowed himself to hope that he was seeing in the Nazis. And again, these other aspects that I mentioned all together, I think, put him in that direction. But I don't think his goal is primarily political. His goal is primarily to understand things as they are.
I wonder, you do teach Heidegger, and I imagine he must have been a very difficult person to teach, to convey to students that this is a man worth reading. And full disclosure, he was a Nazi and all that. So, in by asking, I'd like to ask you, how do you teach Heidegger? But the better question should be, what were the questions that puzzled Martin Heidegger, and why should they puzzle us?
Sure, no, that is a basic question. Heidegger, first of all, thought that everyone before him took for granted a certain notion of what being is, in a manner which preceded even the usual ontology or metaphysics. And that was his fundamental question. Connected to that is a notion of the importance of the practical world, not trying to reduce everything to theory and theoretical understanding, not trying to see everything in the light of physics and physical and mathematical understanding, but an attempt to grasp the human things as the human things, the practical world as the practical world, moods and what they reveal as the things they are. So this fundamental look at the practical world itself, the world of work, the world of everyday activity in itself and standing on its own, that's a fundamental question that he asks. And what that leads to is a novel understanding of moods, of passions, of practical activity, all of which would, of course, be of serious interest to anybody studying things philosophically or studying things and looking at them politically. So it's all of these elements of what's novel about human beings as the being open to being as such. That's crucial. But his fundamental question is, what is the meaning of being as such? What does it mean? What do we take for granted in all of our other activities? So those are the serious reasons why anybody who's serious philosophically or serious about many of the fundamental issues of political philosophy, what is practice, what is the practical world, should look at Heidegger carefully. It's also the case that Heidegger was, in a way, a teacher of many of the thinkers that have become important in political philosophy in the 20th century. You mentioned Hannah Arendt. He was also, to some degree, one of Leo Strauss's teachers, Jacob Klein, Hans Gadamer, Karl Lewith. Some of the fundamental thinkers of the 20th century all studied with Heidegger, and many of them studied very carefully and deeply with Heidegger. So one needs to see that as well.
Yes. I've mentioned that Harvey Mansfield categorized Heidegger as a postmodern philosopher and the greatest among them. So, you hear that word being used as sort of a four-letter word if you listen to, say, Jordan Peterson. Um, but I think the postmodernist school of philosophy is one that should be taken seriously, even if at the end you disagree with them. So my question now to you is, what is the central deviation that the postmodernists have, I guess, starting with Heidegger, from the ancients and the moderns?
Um, Two things. One thing to say is that, and this is leading into the question, one of the things one really learns from Heidegger is how to read Plato and Aristotle seriously, so that a serious look at those thinkers is part of what Heidegger really brought to his students in the early 1920s when he was first beginning his teaching. And a thinker such as Strauss and Klein took their own serious look at these thinkers and moved in a different direction, but on the basis, to some degree, of the territory that Heidegger opened up. And I mention that so that one doesn't have the usual view of what a postmodernist is. Heidegger did try to understand these thinkers in this novel and fundamental way, though always connected to this understanding that they missed something basic. Back now to the original question. When Leo Strauss developed his notion of ancients and moderns, or classics and moderns, there were various waves of modernity, as he said. And the third wave is the one that begins with Nietzsche. And that's really the basis of what later comes to be thought of, I think, as postmodernism. And what is central in it is the fundamental importance of history, the fundamental importance of fate, destiny, power, all of those attempts to see things not as thinkers or even as other authors thought of them themselves, but to see them always in some other term or some other point of view. Heidegger is the most powerful thinker for whom history, fate, destiny are fundamental issues, all of which he connects to his understanding of being and being as such. The way in which people look at Nietzsche now is very much influenced by Heidegger's understanding. Much of what one calls deconstructionism is very much influenced by Heidegger's understanding. The existentialism, which used to be so important to intellectuals in the 1950s and 1960s, has its roots in Heidegger. So Heidegger is the serious source of much of the activity and many of the movements which are the ground of postmodernism. But the heart of it is this attempt, ultimately, that you can see very clearly in Nietzsche, to understand understanding itself as a matter of will, power, creation, production. And Heidegger has serious elements of that, but is not someone you would simply reduce to that either, I think.
I'm glad you mentioned Nietzsche, because a previous guest of this show is a professor at Eureka College, Ronald Reagan's alma mater.
Right.
He's David Eisenberg. He's a professor of political science there. He recently wrote a treatise on Nietzsche in Tocqueville, and you actually had a blurb on his book, and
Right.
so I'd like to mention that. I think one of the key ways for us to understand Heidegger is to understand what phenomenology is, that long multi-syllabic word and concept. I believe the first phenomenologist is Edmund Husserl, who was Heidegger's mentor, but the concept existed long before that, when Kant separated the noumena from the phenomena, things as they are and things as they seem. So can you explain to us what phenomenology is, and Edmund Husserl's influence on Heidegger.
Yeah, well, as you said, Husserl is Heidegger's teacher and mentor, and of course, a fundamental figure for him intellectually. Aristotle and Kant, you might say, the other two most fundamental thinkers for him intellectually, at least at the beginning of his career. Phenomenology is the attempt to see things as they are, to the things themselves, and to make all of your arguments and points about things material that you drew and you draw from the things themselves, not from some pre-existing theoretical understanding or other kind of understanding. In many ways, it's closer to the kind of activity that you could connect with Plato and Aristotle, really, in a way, than it is with Kant and Kant's distinction, because a phenomenologist wouldn't ultimately agree with this distinction between the phenomena and the noumena. Heidegger explains what he means by phenomenology near the beginning of Being and Time, but criticizes Husserl as well in some of his lecture courses, which were later published. In a sense, what Heidegger, a central concept in phenomenology is intentionality. Everything you see and understand is connected to your orientation towards it, to how you see it. And much of Heidegger's understanding of human beings is to have the broadest understanding of what we are and who we are, to have this kind of pre-existing understanding, to have an early understanding, and to see what interpretation really is. But still, the heart of phenomenology is the attempt to see things simply as they are, to draw what you say about things simply from what they are. And then Husserl has a variety of methods to attempt to do that, but you don't see that so much in Heidegger himself.
Right. So Heidegger's seminal work is Being and Time, German, Sein und Zeit, and it is a very difficult work to read, even in English. So I guess in the most accessible way to explain it, how would you explain his treatment of these two concepts?
Yeah, so it's a difficult work even in German, and if you know German, though not as difficult as it is in English. But even in German, there are a lot of neologisms. He makes up lots of words and lots of phrases. So that's one thing that makes it difficult. And a second thing is that he doesn't mean by many of the things he discusses what one would normally or usually mean philosophically. So Sein und Zeit, being and time. The question, as I said, that drives being and time is, what is the meaning of being? What allows being to be intelligible? What do we understand it as? How do we understand it at all? And the time part of it is that a certain notion of time, temporality, is the horizon in terms of which we understand being. So that's the link ultimately. The meaning of being is ultimately temporal, but temporal in a manner which is not identical with the usual understanding of time, let's say physically or by a physicist, or even in everyday time, where it's a succession of nows, now this, now that, and so on. But something much more closely connected to human time, time for this, time for that, time for this discussion, for example, rather than simply countable. That's a first clue, but the full understanding of temporality goes beyond that. And the link between being and time is that in this fuller understanding of temporality, some of which, but only some of which, is laid out in Being and Time, you find the ground for the meaning of being. That's the connection, being and time. The heart of the book, however, is an understanding of human being. Why? Because we are the being who understands being, because we have to understand our own being. Not philosophically, but simply in the way we are, since we are open. What possibilities will we choose? How will we be? So because we're the beings open to being, understanding us is a first great clue to understanding being simply. And then, as I said, time is in a way the horizon in terms of which being has its meaning.
Of course, with his intense focus on being as a concept, we might categorize Heidegger as an existentialist. And in fact, I think his ideas have influence amongst many. Jean-Paul Sartre, who named one of his works "Being and Nothingness" as an obvious homage to Heidegger. I wonder if Heidegger himself would categorize himself as part of the existentialist school.
Right. So being and nothingness, Sartre, it's more than an homage. I think from Heidegger's point of view, it's something like a stealing of his concepts and a misusing of them. And Heidegger thought that, I think, about a lot of thinkers who followed him. Yes, Heidegger never would have categorized himself as an existentialist, because his attempt was to understand what being is. It's not an attempt to understand human being on its own, and the concepts or thoughts that he had about human being were always connected to this attempt to understand being simply. Another thing to say is that Heidegger didn't understand his view of authenticity as somehow a preferred way of life. It's not a way of life, it's a stance towards being. So all of those elements of existentialism that one connects with authenticity as a kind of stance toward life or a way of life or a form of practice, Heidegger wouldn't have liked any of that. Heidegger objected to all of the existentialists who, from his point of view, took his concepts, but in the wrong direction. And that's how he would have understood Sartre. He did, however, have lots of connections with French thinkers, especially after the Second World War, who, from his point of view, were closer and better followers. Though Heidegger was always interested, you mentioned Hannah Arendt, Heidegger was always interested in trying to rehabilitate himself, both in the US and France, intellectually rehabilitating himself. Never apologized for his politics, but he wanted still to have intellectual influence. And that had something to do with the French thinkers that he was closest to. But he never would have called himself, didn't like being thought of as an existentialist.
So I hear that from Harvey Mansfield's reading of Tocqueville. Tocqueville believes that all Americans are Cartesians, followers of René Descartes, without knowing it. And so I liken that to how today's popular culture, especially in hip hop culture, authenticity is put on a very high premium. And so I guess rappers are Heideggerians without knowing it. How would Heidegger conceptualize this concept, authenticity?
Yeah, so there's sort of two forms or roots of authenticity. To some degree, you can connect it back to Rousseau and Rousseauian Romanticism, and often that's what it really comes down to. In Heidegger, it's broader than that and meant to be more philosophic. Most of the time, we misunderstand ourselves. We think of our being and treat our being as if we are merely things like any other thing, as if we're objects like any other object. And what's unique about human being, this openness to being, this undecidedness of our possibilities, what's unique about us is what we miss or don't see. Authenticity is when we do understand ourselves, if even for a moment, in terms of the being that we actually are. And what makes that possible? What makes that possible is coming to grips with human death or dying, not as the demise of an animal, but as a kind of possible impossibility of all our possibilities, as he says. What makes that possible for human beings is the mood of anxiety, where the meaning of everything fades away. And when he thinks of things that way, we begin to see our responsibility in a way for meaning and for being. That's the heart of authenticity as he sees it. It's not a question of being true to what you think you are, because what you think you are is likely to be just the same everyday misinterpreted activity and possibilities and thoughts that everybody else has. So it's a different kind of concept and a different kind of understanding as Heidegger himself sees it. The link is that authenticity in Heidegger does mean that you see yourself in terms of the being and the modes of being and the forms of being that human beings actually have and are. But it's different from a usual view of authenticity, which is sometimes not that far away from kind of sincerity. If Heidegger were actually to hear about rap music, I doubt that he would ever allow himself to listen to it. I'm sure he would consider that just to be another step in the general vulgarization, right, of human beings and the dominance of technology as he actually understands it.
I read your essay on what Heidegger thought about technology, and I thought that really broadened my understanding of the German. So the way I read it, at least from the essay, I believe that you were trying to get at the fact that while technology has prolonged our lives in many ways and have brought us to abundant material possessions, it has somehow reduced the meaning that we find in life, in that it takes us away from our anxiety towards death, and with the rise of anti-aging cream, even aging. So I'm guessing Heidegger himself is not a Luddite. He does not repudiate technology. He doesn't want to live in a technology-less world. But I think this is the point where his thoughts become the most relevant, because we are dominated by technology in our lives. This conversation is possible due to technology. But so, what would be Heidegger's guide for us to live in a tech-filled world?
Yeah, so Heidegger's certainly not a Luddite, though he did spend a lot of his time in a hut in near Freiburg, and lots of his understanding of things comes from a real appreciation of the ordinary world of everyday activity. But a Luddite he certainly is not. He understood technology as a fundamental way in which all entities, all beings, all things approach us in their meaning these days. Everything is first seen by us in terms of its possibility to be a resource not for any particular end or purpose, but simply a resource for other resources in a kind of endless and you might say pointless activity. So he understood technology to be a fundamental way in which entities now have their being. But it's a being with, as you suggested, fundamentally no meaning. Or it's a being in which, when we understand ourselves technologically, we're furthest away from understanding ourselves as we truly are. Though we're furthest away, there's also something about that distance which allows us to, in a certain sense, see or have the possibility of seeing what our being truly is. So that's Heidegger's basic notion. Everything is a resource for something else, and everything loses its own wholeness. Good example might be the way in which all big companies now have human resources departments. Human beings are just resources for this kind of endless activity leading nowhere. That's his understanding. But he doesn't have a solution or a recommendation in any concrete way, because any concrete recommendation would itself turn out to be merely technological. Part of the problem, you might say, ultimately, not something which takes distance from it. What he's looking for is to see the way in which this the technological world now perhaps would enable us to see our being as it truly is. What that would actually mean or amount to is not clear. Just as it was never clear, and he didn't mean it to be clear, what seeing yourself authentically might mean here and now. So no particular solutions. Heidegger, in the 1960s, became fashionable among some of the German Greens because they saw this technological view of Heidegger's as connected to a kind of environmentalism. And you could see elements of that in Heidegger, but ultimately that's not the direction that he would be taking, because again, any ordinary environmentalism would turn out just to be part of the technological problem in its own way. Technology is not primarily a matter of machines. It's primarily a matter of seeing everything in a certain way so that it can then be a resource for continued use in every way and continued misuse. One of his examples is to see the Rhine River not as it is, but as a power source for electric generating stations. That's the kind of example that he had in mind, but the solution is not a solution. It's perhaps a new form of seeing as we see what our being actually is, and perhaps is capable of, and who we are. But that's as far as it would go concretely. Whereas in the period in which he was a member of the Nazi Party and rector of his university after the Nazis took over, there I think he did think that that would lead to a possibility of university reform, of a connecting of the German people, of a purifying maybe of the people, hence his understanding of Jews and others. But by the time he's thinking of the technology argument, there's a greater distance from any concrete practical meaning or result.
I see. Of course, a common caricature of the postmodernists, which again Heidegger is the greatest among them, is that they don't read the ancients, they don't read their predecessors, and they repudiate them before they read them. But Heidegger, on the other hand, took his predecessors seriously, especially the ancients. And I would like to ask, how would he read his predecessors, especially Plato and Aristotle?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and it's, I think, and it's a true point. Post-Heideggerians will often not read any of these previous thinkers seriously. Why? Because they think they've learned from Heidegger that they all missed or ignored something fundamental, and therefore don't need to be read with that seriousness. Heidegger never thought such a thing. And as I said, he opened up a fundamental new understanding of many of these thinkers, perhaps most visibly and importantly Aristotle, since many of his early courses in the 1920s were on Aristotle. And this remarkable new understanding that he developed was often something worked through in conjunction with reading Aristotle. So Heidegger points you to the texts themselves. He rarely goes through a whole text from beginning to end. The one great example of that is his course on Plato's Sophist, which has now been translated, which also has a large portion on Book 6 of Aristotle's Ethics. But that will give you a good example, the Sophist, of how he would go through a work, as it were, from beginning to end. Most of his studies of these earlier thinkers are not of that sort. He takes particular passages which he thinks are particularly important and tries to push away all of the encrusted, traditional, scholarly meaning and understanding. so that one can look not just at the texts themselves, but at the phenomena that the thinkers were looking at as they developed their argument. Right? That's what's really in many ways fundamental. What were they considering in order to make the arguments and claims that they actually make? And that's what Heidegger attempted to do. At one point, he said that you should study Aristotle for 10 or 15 years before you do anything else. And I think he meant that at least with some degree of seriousness. So if you're carefully reading Aristotle, Kant, Descartes, Nietzsche, and others, it's very useful to see what Heidegger actually has to say about them. It's always illuminating, and he always took them seriously. Another reason he took them seriously beyond simply all that he thought he could learn from them is that if human beings are essentially historical, as he sees it, then our understanding of the basic problems, questions, and issues can't avoid what has come about historically and how things have occurred historically, what being means, what human beings mean, what subjectivity means, and objectivity means historically. You can't simply understand matters by leaping away from those fundamental historical developments. So that if you really want to understand, let's say, Descartes, and therefore perhaps what Tocqueville had in mind in what you stated, Heidegger's understanding is a very useful thing to try to keep in mind. So he's much more serious about previous thinkers than a lot of the people who follow him.
I see. So I believe America's interest in Martin Heidegger began when a host of German emigres came to America. You mentioned Hannah Arendt and Leo Strauss being one of them. Others include those of the Frankfurt School. Herbert Marcuse was one of them. He was pretty famous during the 60s. So you can say that Heidegger is a German import as much as, say, BMW cars or Marlene Dietrich. But I wonder if these days American political philosophy departments maintain their interest in Heidegger, or his political associations prove too much of a hurdle.
I never think that political philosophy departments or philosophy departments in America had that great an interest in Heidegger. American philosophy departments had for a long while and still do a kind of division between analytic thought and what they called continental thought, the European continent. So I don't think Heidegger was ever fundamental in many of those departments. Where he was important is in some philosophy departments, but never in the broadest ones, generally speaking. And a lot of the emigres for whom Heidegger was so serious didn't teach Heidegger. Klein, Strauss. So their students understood the importance of Heidegger, but they didn't themselves teach Heidegger. Marcuse, who was a student of Heidegger in the 1920s, a serious student, his primary loyalty, however, was always to a kind of Marxism, right? Always to a kind of Marxism, a Frankfurt School Marxism. And when you look at the works that were most important when he came to the US, Eros and Civilization, One-Dimensional Man, they're elements of Heidegger that you can see when you look carefully, but the ground of them really is a kind of Marxism. And he remains an important thinker these days, though many people don't realize how much they've taken from Marcuse. The basic reintroduction of Heidegger, or you might even say introduction in some cases, to the US came once his works were translated. And Hannah Arendt had a lot to do with organizing the translations, finding the translators, and so on. Being in Time wasn't translated until 1962. And so it takes a translation, I think, for a thinker to begin to be read more widely. But he's never been a broad staple of American philosophy departments, just a figure looked at seriously in some of them and by occasional thinkers in important departments, but not broadly and generally, I would say.
Perhaps one could say that the most radical elements of the American left are Foucaultians and Marcusean, without knowing that they are.
Yeah, I would certainly say that's correct. And it's certainly Marcuse, everyone in the 1960s knew that he was a kind of intellectual ground for many of the anti-war, in particular, students during the 1960s, and a lot of the revolution in American student life, maybe even to a degree in German student life as well. That was well known, and a lot of the people who were involved in that read Marcuse. He wasn't just a name. They would have read him and known things about him. Now, I don't know that they read much of anything, but you can see that they've got these roots in Marcuse and maybe to a degree Foucault as well, right?
Yes. I've heard that you said that after the Nazi regime fell apart, Heidegger, at least in the 60s, began to take an interest in the kind of leftism that were practiced by student protesters. So I wonder what was the translation? How did he move from Nazism to left-wing student activism?
Right. No. So after the war, after the Nazis were defeated, Heidegger was not allowed to teach for 5 years or so. Yeah. So his activities in support of the Nazis were well understood. He gave lectures, finally began to teach again, and moved back into the center of things in Germany again. The connection with the student left is that there's always a radicalism in Heidegger. Heidegger was always interested in kind of a radical understanding of intellectual life, a radical understanding of university life, an attempt at radical change in one way or another. So he was sympathetic to the distance a lot of the student left, not the terrorist student left in Germany, but the student left in Germany in the 60s. He saw, I think, some connections with the radicalism that he preferred. But ultimately, his interests were not that, were not environmentalism, were not any of these things, but his own thought and what it might mean. But there's this central radicalism, distance from liberal democratic practices, distance from typical academic practices, which I think is the basis of the connection. It's also the case, one has to remember Nazism is National Socialism, and there's a socialist element which is very important in it. And Heidegger was never a friend of capitalism.
That's it. So, final question. I imagine that reading Heidegger would require a lot of preparation. You got to read the text of his predecessors, and a fair bit of caution since everything we've talked about. But so, if that hasn't been made clear already, I'd like you to make the case for reading Heidegger and the relevance of his work today.
Well, the main reason to read Heidegger is his great intelligent grasp of so many fundamental human issues and human questions. You need to confront and try to understand his view of practice in the practical world, his view of moods and passions, his view of understanding, his view of history. One needs to really pay attention to those things if one really means to understand. One needs to pay attention to his view of all these previous and important thinkers if one really means to understand and confront them. So there's so much to learn from Heidegger because of the depth of his understanding. But you have to always keep in mind the political connection, the political association, the association with the Nazis. So you need to read him carefully but keep that association in the back of your mind, and sometimes right in the front of your mind when you're really thinking concretely about political things. But there are all of these things to learn from Heidegger on these central and important issues. And if you haven't confronted his thought, you've missed a lot and haven't confronted things you need to confront to truly understand. So that's my case for both reading him, but reading him with caution.
On that note, thank you very much, Professor Mark Blitz of Claremont McKenna College, for guiding us through this brilliant, difficult, and controversial philosopher, Martin Heidegger. And thank you for continuing to inspire the younger generations like myself to the discipline of political philosophy.
Well, thank you very much.
I wish you the best with your school year, and I hope you take care of yourself.
Thank you, and I wish you the best as well.